Sometimes I go around and I tell founders about how to build products from 0 to 1. And as both an entrepreneur and an advisor and an angel investor, I feel like we are all great at dishing out advice, and we always sound confident. And hopefully, you find my advice valuable. All right. So first, let me talk a little bit about who I am to give you a bit of context. I usually ask about who you guys are first, but we're all founders here, so I love the businesses that you guys are building. So I'll skip that. So I'll talk about myself. All right, so this is a picture of the Huaqiangbei electronics market, which is in Shenzhen, China. I know that some of you guys are dealing with hardware, so perhaps you recognize something similar. This is where I grew up. I grew up in Shenzhen, China, and some people call this the Silicon Valley of China. I remember when I was 8, my father took me to this electronics market where you have like the different stalls and you can buy like the different components for a PC. And my father and I picked all the different components and we took it home and we put it all together into a computer. And on that computer, I wrote my first line of code. So I've been writing code since I was 8. I don't have a slide about Florida, but I'll talk a little bit about actually my life in Florida. So when I immigrated to the US when I was 13, we went to Jacksonville, Florida. And I went to University of Florida for my undergrad and I studied finance. So I grew up partially in Florida, loved it, really hot, but it was a great time. Like any other good financier who studied finance in undergrad, my dream job was to work at a bulge bracket investment bank. And it was pretty difficult to do that, having not graduated, from a tier 1 school. But throughout blood, sweat, and tears, I made that happen. There was blood involved, but I won't go into that. So I got my first job as a fixed income trader on a fixed income desk in New York at Merrill. And I was there for about 2 years. And frankly, after 2 years, I was just really burned out. And I was just like, well, I've always loved to build things. I feel like I'm just kind of being a cog in a wheel. Like I was sitting on the trading desk and I was like writing Python scripts, trying to like automate myself out of my job. I was like, okay, I got to do something else. I got to like actually build things. So I left Wall Street. But it's not because I hated Wall Street, but it was more because like I just wanted to build cool things. So I went from working at 2 of the largest financial institutions in the world to founding and working at 4 different startups. I'll talk a little bit about LTSE, but LTSE is my 4th startup. So I've done things in e-commerce, in B2B SaaS, I've done B2C things, took quite a few detours, and this talk is about the learnings I've learned along the way, and hopefully you guys don't make the same mistakes as I did. All right, so I'm at LTSE now. LTSE stands for the Long-Term Stock Exchange. If you Google us, you probably mostly hear about our exchange. We are also America's newest stock exchange. We're at the same regulatory category as the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. And our focus is to help companies be public in a different environment. But the exchange is not the only thing that we do. I remember when I joined the company about 3.5 years ago, I was employee number 11. I was not the founder of LTSE, but I joined early on. And I sat down with our our investor, Reid Hoffman, and he told me the story of how he founded LinkedIn, grew it, took it public, and eventually he saw his stock price drop by half overnight in the public market because they missed the earnings by like 2 pennies or something. And he went into work the next day, and it's the same building, same Michelin star chef cooking in a cafeteria, same people, same everything. Like nothing felt different except that the stock price was dropped by half, and all the employees are kind of freaking out. They're like, "Oh shit, how am I going to retire?" So eventually, he sold to Microsoft at a slight discount. It did bounce back a little, but he did have to sell. And he was like, well, if I have what you guys are trying to build at the long-term stock exchange in terms of the suite of tools and the exchange that you're building, LinkedIn could have been actually a very different outcome. And that's why I'm backing you guys. And that was one of the reasons why I joined. We are a team of founders, at least the early employees. We were a team of founders. We're trying to build things that we wish we had when we were founders, but we're building it for the next generation of founders like you. To help you with this entrepreneur journey from founding all the way to IPO and beyond. And we do that in terms of building software to help you grow, form the company and grow. We built that with a coalition of long-term investors, now with over $7 trillion of asset under management. And we also do that by being an exchange, and we're granted by the sovereign power of the United States government to regulate. So we have some special powers there. And the other interesting thing about LTSE is that we're founded by Eric Ries, who wrote the cult classic, The Lean Startup. So you might have heard of this book. He's the guy that helped to popularize some of the concepts that you may hear about, such as MVP, minimum viable product, or pivot. And if you have the book and if you flip to the last page, he actually says, hey, I wish somebody would build a stock exchange that will help with the long-term growth of companies. And then after he wrote the book, I think back in 2008, several years later, nobody did it. So Marc Andreessen was like, well, why don't you do it? So that's how we became a startup. And currently we are a Series B startup with almost 50 employees now. So we're actually still quite small. All right. Any questions about my background or LTSE? Okay, I'll keep going. So this talk is about building a product from 0 to 1. So I think the first thing to note is that startups are not like big companies, and building products from 0 to 1 is not like building product from 1 to 100. So I think it's important to recognize this. And we've learned quite a few things, both as we build ourselves from 0 to 1, and also we learned from the 40,000 startups on our platform. So right now, my products serve about 1 in 5 venture-backed startup in the US. So I talked to a lot of founders, and some of the learnings are also from what they've done in the past. And some of the common mistakes is that people think that, well, building product from 0 to 1 is like building it from 1 to 100. It's the same as scaling product. But what people don't remember, even by going from big companies to small companies, is that big products have different departments. They have these like 20-page product requirement documents they have to write. People overspend on building products. They overhire. Sometimes it's actually not necessary. Like if you ever work at a big company, you're like, what does that department do? Yeah, you don't have that problem in small startups. So here's a quote that I really like. Steve Blank, who's one of Eric's mentors. He's an author and also an 8-time entrepreneur. And he says that a small startup is not a smaller version of a larger company. A startup is a completely different beast. And why is that? It's because startups are designed to do a specific thing, to learn and learn fast. And that's how they can differentiate themselves from a larger company. And usually, if you look at the history of both startups and just companies in general, it's usually whoever learns the fastest will win. That's the secret to startups. Because you always have competitors. Whether you're a startup or a big company, you always have competitors. So I think one of the common things I hear from entrepreneurs, especially like first-time entrepreneurs coming from big companies, is that I'm trying to like invent a new category. I'm trying to do something completely new. I don't have any direct competitors. But that's like almost always not true. You almost have some kind of substitute product or some kind of competitor, whether it's like another startup or a large company that's like swimming in your lane, trying to do something, maybe not exactly the same as what we're trying to do, but doing something similar. And of course, your bigger competitors come with more prominent brands, more people, more money. So how do you win? And the only way to win is to learn faster. And we'll talk about that in this presentation. So here's a mistake I made at one of my previous startups. So at my previous company, I built a search engine, which is basically a Google Scholar competitor. So it's not Google, it's Google Scholar, specifically for academic search. and we deliver a search engine and a search data to universities such as Stanford, Harvard, MIT, a lot of tier 1 schools. So my team, it was a team of about 15 people, product managers, front-end engineers, designers. We built our first version. Like, you can even call this one an MVP, even though it might not look like an MVP because it's somewhat polished. But we spent about 6 months building kind of like this fancy 3D graph UI for this search engine. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because Google Scholar is actually backed by keyword search. It's like basic stuff, right? Like you search for the term Pablo in the paper and it shows up, an exact match. But we're actually backed by a graph engine, a graph similar to how Google is done. And one of the reasons why Google Scholar doesn't work as well as Google is because it's keyword search. It's not knowledge graph-based search. And we thought, well, because we're backed by this cool technology called the knowledge graph, why don't we build like this fancy 3D UI that's literally a graph, right? So it took us 6 months to build this fancy 3D UI. And also it took us like 2 extra months to prepare for trade show, because we're like, oh, we're going to go to this trade show. We're going to present this like fancy, cool looking thing that is going to wow everyone. And you can just imagine, well, like the hockey stick is just going to commence, right? It's going to shoot straight up. But like almost all things that are, properly and carefully planned, it did not go according to the plan. So it turned out that we went to the trade show and people actually didn't care. Well, there were two things that they didn't care about. Number one, they didn't care about the UI. They actually like the blue links. Like you search on Google and it gives you like 10 blue links, right? They actually like the 10 blue links because it's simple. It's like, oh, I search and I kind of like the first link is, it's super relevant to me. I click and I'm done, right? I don't want to spend a lot of time on your UI. So that's one thing they didn't like. And the second thing that they didn't like was that, well, they didn't even actually care about the fact that we had a search engine. They were actually really curious about the data behind the scenes, that graph data that we have that backs this entire search engine. And actually, we had a few inquiries that just wanted to license our graph data. So never mind the search engine. And that's actually what we did with Stanford. We actually sold them the data, not the search engine itself initially. So that was 6 months of building and 2 months of preparing for the trade show. Now, a typical startup raises funding for 18 months, right? So the usual pattern is that you raise, say your seed round, you run for 18 months, and after 12 months, you're like, okay, time to plan for my next round, right? So your maximum runway is likely only 18 months. Now, out of the 18 months, we just spent 6 months building this. And that took us to a learning that basically invalidated our original hypothesis. So that was a big problem. So the learning from this was that, well, we actually had to learn faster. If we just like picked up our phone and called our customers and maybe just show them this screenshot and say, hey, would you use this? And they might say, well, it looks cool, but I
think he froze.
Yeah, we'll give him a second. It's probably just Wi-Fi issues. I'm gonna reach out to him right now.
This wouldn't happen on Vardy.
Yeah, next time we have to use Vardy for sure.
What did he say? He's gonna hop out and hop back in.
We're waiting for a reply now. Just reach out to him. Oh, he's here.
Am I back?
You're back.
Sorry about that. I think my internet has been going on and off. They're like doing real surgery around my house. So sorry about that. I'm tethered
That's
on my
okay.
phone now. So let me know if, yeah. All right, cool. I will keep going. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Great, cool. Okay, so the reason why we use a structured build, measure, learn cycle in this framework is because we want to have a structured scientific approach. Some of you guys might study science in school, and the whole idea is that you want to apply scientific experimentation to everything that you do. At least that's what we do. And this is what we do day to day at LTSE. So just to summarize, build is to build your MVP, your minimum viable product. So that's the least you can deliver to the customer to generate your learnings. Now, a lot of people think like the minimum in MVP or the lean in startup is about not spending as much money as possible as a startup, to be like as cheap as possible to conserve cash, right? And that's actually what Eric ran into before he wrote the book. Like he'll go around and he would tell other startups about his cool new idea called the lean startup, and people are like, oh, so you are like the cost savings guy, right? Like I need to sell my like used office furniture. Like, can you help me with that? So people didn't realize that like that's not what he meant by lean or minimal. It's not about spending money. It's about doing the least amount possible to generate the learnings that you need. The measure is how your customers respond to you. And the learn piece is about what we call the pivot or persevere decision, which we'll talk about. So the reason why we use the scientific experimentation approach is because, well, number one, we want to make it repeatable for everything that we do. And number two, we want to run the fastest loop possible to have the fastest time to impact and time to market. So we'll talk about that. All right, so first, in order to build, you need to figure out what to build. And before you actually build something, what we do is that we write down our assumptions. Now, you may have noticed that I call them assumptions, not plans, because I think the old school way of building a startup is that what people say, well, you should have a business plan. Here is a 50-page template, just like fill in the blank, right? Have your spreadsheet and do your 10-year projection. But of course, like those never come true, especially for early stage startups. Even 1-year projections don't work. So we write down our assumptions so we can form our hypothesis. And keep in mind that like assumptions and hypotheses, they're not forecasts because nothing will ever go according to the plan. So we try to keep it as simple and small as possible. Here are some examples of the assumptions that we'll write down if we were to build a CRM product. A CRM is a customer relationship management, right? Customer relationship management. So it's like a Salesforce or a Copper or something, right? So if we want to say reinvent the CRM category, we want to build a new CRM product. So here are the assumptions that we have. Well, number one, everybody wants a CRM. Is that true? I don't know. Who knows, right? Number two, customers agree that existing solutions have gaps. And number three, customers will give you the data. Because the whole idea of a CRM is that like you track your customer data in one central system, right? Number four, the needs are consistent. Because at the end of the day, you want to build software. You don't want to build like one thing, like a different spreadsheet, solution for every customer separately, right? So we want to validate the needs are consistent. And number five, that you can actually build it. Perhaps it's something so complicated. Maybe it's like like a nuclear science that like you don't actually have the expertise to build it, right? So you also have to validate that you can actually build it. So there are a couple of tips on how to form these assumptions. Well, number one, that your assumptions should sound so dumb that you're embarrassed to say them out loud. So like everyone wants a CRM. Well, yeah, no kidding. Like, if that's false, why are you even building this, right? But that's what's great about this assumption, because it's so simple that you can validate it by running an experiment, and your answer to this assumption is true or false. So your answer to all these assumptions has to be true or false. It has to be very black and white. It cannot be, well, maybe like half the people kind of want a CRM, 75% of people, are on like a scale of like 1 to 10, they're like a 7 out of 10. Like never mind any of that. Like the assumptions have to be true for all these assumptions in order for you to even want to proceed to the next step. So that's how we form these assumptions. They have to be true for the product to succeed. And then after we list these assumptions down, we design experiments for each of them. So for each of them, we'll run a build, measure, learn cycle loop. And I see a raised hand. So Marwan and Walden, do you guys have a question?
Yeah, man. I have huge respect for Eric's work, and Lean Startup is definitely like one of the most like impactful books I've read. The one sort of kind of snag I run into with the Lean Startup thinking is thinking about a lot of like really great startups like, you know, Uber or Airbnb. Their key assumption is that you will get in a stranger's like car or house. And if you were to run an experiment on that, even multiple experiments in many different ways, that you would have always gotten a no, and that would have probably pushed these companies towards trying to iterate. So how do you sort of balance the, like, you know, listening to market data and iterating on your product versus cracking like an assumption that used to be false and now is very, very much true and therefore like very transformative?
Yeah, I can't speak to Uber, but I can cite an example from Airbnb, which arguably is a similar, you know, two-sided marketplace product, right? Also, I can also cite an example from DoorDash, which could be similar. Actually, I have an example of Airbnb later on in the presentation, but you know, if I was to summarize it, like the way that Brian and Tim did it was that, well, like you might think, well, it's crazy to want to sleep on a stranger's couch, right? Like both as the traveler and as the homeowner, because how are you going to know that, you know, you're not going to sleep, you know, at some, you know, psychotic, you know, serial killer's couch, right? So that's a huge assumption to validate. And the way they did it was actually one of the things that we'll talk about here is, you know, by what YC calls doing things that don't scale. So a lot of the times when you build products in the beginning, it's about, you know, doing things that don't scale. What that means is that like, maybe like you don't build a software solution first, that like you want to actually like personally concierge your customer as the first step, right? So like, you know, Brian would like open up his own couch and like have people come in and, you know, sleep on his couch and rent it for, I don't know, whatever. Well, they started as, you know, air bed and breakfast, right? So it was literally like his air bed that he was renting out for some convention that was happening in San Francisco. And by doing that, by having people like manually come in and sleep on your own couch, you know, some of the learnings that he had was, well, number one, like what's important for the traveler to trust the host, right? And one of their key learnings is that photography is a really important thing, right? Because that really boosts the credibility of the location itself. And number two, that you want to hook your profiles up to a social network like Facebook, right? And this is arguably why Facebook Marketplace is growing really fast compared to Craigslist, because you're not dealing with, you know, just a random email address or phone number, right? You can actually kind of see the profile of that person on Facebook, you know, whether it's in the Facebook Marketplace case or the Airbnb case, right? Like that kind of like builds some sense of trust. So these are some of the learnings that they had in the beginning that helped to kind of overcome the hurdle. Like basically they validated their assumptions that like, yes, people will want to sleep on a stranger's couch because it's not just a couch, it's a fancy place with a known host, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to find a serial killer. And that has happened, right? You know, you probably have heard of, you know, Airbnbs getting trashed because, you know, we all know what people do at hotels in Miami, right? You know, in spring break. So that doesn't mean that you're going to have, you know, 0% chance for problems. But the idea is that, you know, by doing things that don't scale and personally concierging your first cohort of customers, you learn enough that validates your assumption that at least allows you to move into the next step. And now that they've grown big enough, they're able to hire a full team of lawyers and compliance people to work on trust and safety. Because at least they know that 99.9% of the case is not going to be a serial killer. And for that 0.01% of the chance, you do need a team of specialists and experts to deal with those. Is that helpful?
So yeah, that's super helpful. Can I just ask a quick follow on? When you're doing these experiments, are you looking for, like, I guess like with most science experiments, you're looking for a way to invalidate the thesis, not for a way to validate it. With like a lean startup experiment, are you trying to find like under what parameters would this work? Or are you trying to find why, I guess, why is this not working is kind of the same question, but in reverse.
Yeah.
Like, I guess to put it more concisely, are you trying to like prove yourself wrong or see how you can prove yourself right?
Yeah. So it's not about right or wrong or validating or invalidating. It's about learning more than what you know before, right? So let's take an example here. Everyone wants a CRM. But that actually, like now thinking twice about it, I don't even know why I wrote that down because it actually sounded like a terrible assumption in the beginning. Like, why would you want to build a CRM product to compete with Salesforce, right? Like typically what people say startups should do is that you should build something that's very focused. Like you want to serve a niche group of customers to make sure that you can do that, right? And then you expand from there, right? So actually that sounds like a terrible assumption. And perhaps like if I was to run an experiment on that, I would literally like, here will be my experiment. I'll phone up 10 of my friends and I'll say, do you want a CRM? And I want 10 out of 10 people to say yes before I proceed with my next experiment. Now, it turned out that perhaps, 5 out of 10 people said, no, I don't want a CRM. I'm fine with a spreadsheet because I'm running a cookie shop. Like I don't need Salesforce implementation and Accenture to come in to like build my shit, right? So it turned out that you basically invalidate your hypothesis, but you learn something in the process. Okay, so now what I will do is that, okay, out of the 5 people that said yes, I will go back and I will try to ask them something else, and I will say, okay, you said that you want a CRM. What kind of CRM do you want? Like, are you already using one? Right. And if you are, then it kind of goes into the next assumption, like customers agree that existing solutions have gaps. Maybe all millions of Salesforce customers love it so much that they would never, ever buy another CRM ever again. And, like people sometimes say that about software, right? Like I think, CSAT and NPS for something like Slack is super high, right? So perhaps you're like, oh, I love Slack. I would never want to buy another like Microsoft Team or something, so if I invalidate that, perhaps I'm like, okay, this is a terrible category to be in. Maybe I should pivot and do something else, right? So it's not really about yes or no. It's more about like, can you learn something that you didn't know before? And can you do that fast enough or faster than your competitors and the large companies that you're competing with?
Got it. Super helpful, man. Thank you.
Sure. All right, cool. So now let's actually talk about the build, measure, learn. So again, build is the least you can deliver to a customer to generate learnings. So that is your minimum viable product. Okay, so let's actually talk about do things that don't scale. How many of you guys know Y Combinator? Have you heard of it? Okay, cool. A few of you guys, well, actually pretty much everyone. So this is something that they really teach you during the YC program. So LTSE is a YC company. We were Summer 17. So we also have I'm serving almost 1,000 of our fellow YC companies as my customers. So I talk to a lot of YC founders, and the idea behind doing things that don't scale is that you want to find a small set of early adopters and you serve them really, really well. This is actually not super intuitive. It's actually, when this first came out, it's actually quite contrarian because, companies are usually trying to build for a large market, right? Like, sometimes people say, well, YC won't even accept you unless if you're targeting $1 billion market. But these are actually like 2 totally different concepts. Like whether you're building for $1 billion market, it's not the same as, whether you're doing things that don't scale in the very beginning to get off the ground. And what people don't realize is that having fewer customers is actually your superpower as a startup, because you get to treat them super well. You get to personally concierge them and help them, and you can make them the superheroes. Large companies don't have the opposite problem. They have too many customers. Actually, I'm kind of running into this nowadays. Like you might think it's a good problem to solve, but like sometimes I'm just bombarded with like customer support tickets. I can't even like build my product, right? So having fewer customers actually is kind of nice. And also keep in mind that everybody had 10 customers before they had 100 and 1,000 and 10,000. Right. So the idea is that like you want to find out why would anyone want to use your product at all? It's not about like why would 10 million people use your product? Like why would anyone, like why would your mother use your product? Is it just because like you are her daughter, or is it because your product actually serves her needs? Right. And also the other secret is that nobody knows that you only have a few customers, right? Now, what if you end up with too many customers that you cannot concierge them? Well, that's a good problem to have, because if the market exists, you can always automate with software later. And see, Adam, you have a question.
Yeah. How do you balance like, treating that as an advantage, but also being able to like prove your concept? Like the product is valuable rather than like, oh, you're better than a competitor just because you get that extra attention, which is not like kind of kills the proof of concept in a way, that your product would be valuable. You know what I mean? Like if there are competitors in your space and you're trying to prove that your thing is better than that other thing, but like it might like muddy the answer if it's really just because like, oh, you're able to give this customer so much attention. How do you balance? Is the question clear that I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a few things, like a few ways to think about this. One is that let's assume that you are building a product that like you have an incumbent competitor, right? And excuse me, and you believe that your solution is better, right? So the way that I think about this, and what's called customer development in the book, is that you want your customers. Well, it's about having proof points to prove that your solution is better, right? So how do you prove that, right? One way to think about this is that you want your customers to give you something concrete and that they value in return for what you are providing them. So couple specific examples. One is that, well, the customer that you're trying to concierge literally churned from your customer, right? Like they were using product X and now they're using Varti.io, right? Like, so, if they're like, oh, I just canceled my subscription there and now I'm subscribing with Adam, that's like a very concrete, valuable thing, because they're literally handing you both money and also, a contractual relationship, with you, right? So you want them to give you something of value. And this is why surveys are actually very, very dangerous, because you can go around, you can be like, well, hey, 10 customers, would you use my product? And they're like, sure, I love you, Adam. Like, you're a cool guy. I use your product, right? Any day. But then you're like, oh, great. Like, can I have your credit card? And they're like, no. So surveys are super dangerous. So you want them to provide you something valuable, and it doesn't even need to be money, right? Like it can actually, for large enterprise SaaS sales, it can be like an LI, a letter of intent. And you might think, well, an LI is not binding, it's just a signature on a page. But actually, to get that signature through, in a big corporate environment, they probably need multiple stakeholders to approve that signature. So actually, it could cost them a bit of a pain and time. And you kind of want that, because like you want them to give you something valuable, because then you can, let's say that, you want these proof points to, to be handy, so you can raise your next round. And so you can go to an investor and say, we got 10 LOIs, these like large corporations sign these LOIs, I'm ready. Like I hit my milestone, I'm ready for the next round, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely, for the most part. Like you don't think that like when you go out of your way to like concierge your customers, it makes the proof point less clear, like in terms of like the product itself being the reason?
Okay. I see where you're going with this. It's possible, right? So one of the kind of famous examples of salespeople winning the day is Larry Ellison, Oracle's founder. He's famous for selling $300 million of software contract before they wrote a single line of code, right? Which you're like, I want to hire that guy. I want that guy to be my co-founder, right? Well, then it's to the team's then his team has to step up and actually build the software, right? So yeah, I sometimes you run into the problem of like maybe you're just too good of a salesperson and you're somehow able to like just jam that contract through and people sign with you, but they're like, oh, I only signed because Adam bought me a beer. I didn't actually want to buy Varti.io. Shit, maybe I'll cancel it in a month. So yeah, so I think that could be a danger. But I think this is why you don't just have a single North Star and single metric, right? So customer acquisition and revenue is not your only metric. You also need to work on retention and engagement, right? Like, if you're in a SaaS business and you have a lot of revenue bookings, but nobody actually is using your software, that's a huge red flag, right? And I think as an investor, when I'm doing due diligence on SaaS businesses, and that's something that I ask about, is that like it's not just about how much revenue have you booked, but it's about like, okay, are the customers actually actively engaging and using your solution?
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I have some examples of doing things that don't scale. So here is a picture of the Microsoft office when they were just a couple of guys in Albuquerque, New Mexico, writing basic interpreters for a market of a few thousand hobbyists. And you guys might know, this is how Apple started too. They were just like building hardware for hobbyist groups. And I guess 2 decades later, they're Microsoft and Apple, right? So this is an example of doing things that don't scale, because they are able to cater to a very niche group of hobbyists and cater to them, and they love Microsoft's product, and it grew from there, right? That gave them a beachhead into the software business versus IBM. And talk about Airbnb, which used to be called Airbnb Breakfast. I think this was their version 2 of their website. And you don't want to know what version 1 looks like. So I think Brian, as a designer, would be pretty embarrassed by that. But their learnings was that quality photos equal bookings, and this applies to the real estate itself, and also applies to the profiles of hosts. I think if you guys watch YouTube, you might know that for YouTube thumbnails, or even for things like LinkedIn posts, whenever you have an attractive face, like a human face on a thumbnail, it always attracts better click-through conversion rate than posts or YouTube thumbnails without a human face. So that's why you see all these YouTubers making these funny faces on their thumbnails. There's a reason for it. So because their learnings was that quality photos lead to bookings, they flew to New York, their first major market, and they went door to door. They brought their nice fancy cameras, and they went door to door, and they took photos of all their hosts' places, because like their hosts weren't photographers, right? They just had a air mattress. So they did that, and that's how they got their first stream of bookings. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about recruiting early adopters. I think we touched on some of this, but the way that we do it at LTSE is that, number one, we try to solve our own problem. This doesn't always work. It works for us because we are what Axios, Dan Primack at Axios calls the most important startup for other startups, because we are literally a startup designed to serve other startups, and we are a startup ourselves, so we can actually dogfood our own product pretty well. But you have to be careful with this, because sometimes you build a solution because you personally love it so much, and perhaps you don't even love it, but you're just like so emotionally invested in that thing. But at the end of the day, like only you and your mom are emotionally invested. No one else is. So that could actually be a little dangerous. But if you can be your own customer, that helps a lot, right? Because at least you can spot some of the basic things that like the basic mistakes that you wouldn't make, right? Number 2, identify your best customers and find more like them. All right. So in Microsoft's case, if you're building basic interpreters for a bunch of computing hobbyists, you can ask them, and you can say, oh, well, we went to the new Albuquerque, I don't know, basic interpreter user group, like that user group may have monthly meetings of 50 people, right? And you might go there and you might like, hey, do you know of any other user groups and hobbyist groups that might want a similar thing? So then, that will lead you to like additional places that you can go to. So like your best customers always know other customers that are just like them. It's similar things attract, right? So that's one way to find more early adopters. Another way to do it is that you want to just target a subset of a market in which you can get a critical mass of customers very quickly. Now, this is very challenging for large enterprise SaaS sales, or if you're selling something to government or maybe hospitals, right? That could be pretty tricky because if you're not into that network, it could actually take you forever to get a critical mass of customers very quickly. And like when I say critical mass, I don't mean like get like 50% of your the United States hospitals under contract. I mean like just get 10, right? Like you want enough customers to be able to provide you feedback, and you can somehow like amass some kind of trend, right? So you need a specific sample size, and that might be difficult in that market that you're targeting. So I don't know, maybe instead of hospitals, maybe you can say, well, can I sell to patients, or can I sell to doctors or something, right? So you want to be able to do that quickly. If it takes you like 5 years to get 5 customers, that's a big problem. So you might want to think about something else. And then the last one is, kind of going back to, doing things that don't scale and concierge your customers. You can kind of quote unquote consult for them, but this actually is a very dangerous path, because I've seen many founders that are trying to build software, and they're like, oh, I'm doing a custom solution for this guy, I'm doing a custom solution for that girl. And it turned out that they just end up being an agency, and like no VCs want to fund an agency, and that might be okay. Like you might be okay with that, right? If you don't want to be a high growth venture backed startup, but just be mindful that if everything that you build is a custom solution, then you don't have a product, you have a service, and people don't fund services. So it might just be a great business for you, but it might not be a great business for a VC. So consult, but don't get paid. And if they want to pay you, say, okay, sure, you can pay me, but I want you to sign this subscription agreement. I have an example for this actually. So one of the things that Patrick at Stripe told me was that when he founded Stripe in the early days, he would go to the YC dinners where they feed you terrible pasta. And then he will ask his fellow YC founders, and he'll be like, well, will you use Stripe? And they will say yes. And then he would say, well, give me your laptop now. So it's like you pull out your credit card out. He will literally like sign people up on Stripe.com. So I think you gotta have some of the hustle in order to really like recruit your early set of adopters. All right, questions so far?
I have a question, Ray.
Sure.
When you're doing the build and measure and learn, are there any internal tools that you use specifically to make these work better? Like specific, like for example, this is an example, like Excel to track your data or something like that. Like specific tools that you use to do these processes?
Yeah. So the answer is no. We have some templates. When we get to the learning section, I'll talk about how we make the pivot versus persevere decisions. But we have some basic templates. You might have seen these like there are all kinds of like product management templates online. So we have like one of those, and it's just like, okay, before you run an experiment, you fill out like what are you building, who the customers are, where like what are your metrics that you're measuring, and how do you plan to make the pivot versus persevere decision, and how long will the experiment run for. So we have kind of like a template that's just kind of a little bit like fill in the blank, right? And also it's helpful to document your thinking, because like at least for me, like a week later, I don't remember anything I that was in my head. So it's always helpful to document that. But beyond that, I would say some kind of task management or project management system is helpful. And especially if you are actually doing an engineering build, then you have to coordinate across different functions, right? Product design, engineering, sales support, right? So, we use Trello. Actually, we might migrate to Asana, but I don't have any affinities with any of these. I think any task tracker is fine. If you were using a spreadsheet, I think that's fine. So I think the short answer is no. We don't have a software to manage this. And I wonder, if software will be helpful for small teams. I think, if you are large teams, I think there are some benefits to have maybe a more structured system. But so far, we seem to be okay with just Trello and spreadsheets and Word documents.
Thank you. And then is there a specific timeline that you follow? Like, for example, for the agile, like if you were to practice like agile, that's like two-week sprints. Like, do you do anything in a timely fashion like that?
Yeah. At LTSE, I run both product engineering, at least part of the engineering. And the way that I run my engineering process is I don't know if to be frank, I'm not an expert in agile, so I'm not exactly sure whatever it is that I'm doing is, but basically what we do is that we plan projects, and when we ship whenever things are ready. So we don't actually have sprints. We don't have set release dates, but I think that's just because we're building SaaS software, like we can deploy 10 times a day, or we can deploy, once a year, right? It's just kind of whatever. And previously I worked with a team that came out of Google's Chrome team. And the way that the Chrome release process is that Chrome releases every 6 weeks on a Tuesday. And the features that go into the release is whatever is ready that passes customer and technical validation. So we essentially ship whatever is ready whenever they become ready. We don't have sprints, but what we do have is that we have a structured experiments and build, measure, learn cycles. And for experiment planning, we have what we call we have 6-week cycles, right? So, some companies run on quarterly cycles. We have 6-week cycles. So every 6 weeks, we'll say, okay, what experiments are we doing in the next 6 weeks? How do we decide whether to pivot or persevere at the end of 6 weeks? So that's how we plan the business, but we don't have super structured planning around shipping software.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so on measure, so in the early days, as I mentioned, measure should be that customers are willing to give you something in exchange of what you promise to deliver, something valuable. That could be money, that could be an LOI, signature on a piece of paper. It could be a lot of things. But what you don't want is you don't want what Eric calls vanity metrics. So this is a popular failure mode of measuring. You are kind of just cherry picking metrics that look good, right? Like every startup has a graph that's like a hockey stick, up and to the right. But you kind of wonder, well, if every startup has it, why do 9 out of 10 startups fail? Well, actually, it's actually not true that 9 out of 10 startups fail. I think in early stages, about 8 out of 10 will fail. And in the later stages, about 50% will fail. So depending on what stage you're looking at, the failure is different, but all of them have a hockey stick graph, right? What's up with that? So here's a classic example of a vanity metric, cumulative sales. Well, of course, it's going to go up and to the right because it's cumulative, right? Like you're just kind of like lying to yourself, right? Like hopefully it's not like flat all the time, but this doesn't actually show you the growth. Well, I guess in this way the growth is kind of constant, but this is not great. Now, I do want to say that it's about not confusing yourself and your own team. Vanity metrics can actually be helpful for PR, marketing, competitive landscape. Because I think one thing about startup is that you do want to sort of appear bigger than you are and more serious than you are in the beginning, even though you are just a 2-girl band, right? In the beginning, you want to appear more serious because you want to convey a sense of trust. But you don't want to lie to yourself and your team. You don't want, sorry, I shouldn't use the word lie. It's about confusing yourself because it's like one of those things, like, it's like, how your Uncle Bob told that fishing story so many times, then it's not true, but it kind of almost became reality because he told that so many times, right? So you don't want to confuse yourself about, a graph like this that's literally always up and to the right, because it's impossible for it not to be up and to the right, right? So just let somebody else drink that Kool-Aid. Here are some other examples of vanity metrics. It's the dollar raised. Now, this is a super popular one with entrepreneurs, right? So, Theranos raised 1.4 billion, and we all read that book and the Wall Street Journal article, right? So, just keep in mind, at least the way that we think about raising money at LTSE is that the dollar raised is a lagging indicator. It's a measurement of what you already achieved, of the milestone that you already achieved. It's not the milestone that you want to hit. Like you get a cookie by doing your homework. Like the cookie is like not your end goal. Your goal is to get your homework done, right? So so just be mindful that, like, you know, we always say that, you know, despite how much money we raised, we still have a lot more to do, and we're only able to raise that money because we actually achieve our milestone, which in our case is to get the SEC approval and become America's newest stock exchange, and that's what we raised on. It's like by after achieving that milestone, we raised our money. Okay, so a lot of companies talk about a North Star, right? Like kind of like one metric to focus the whole company around. And that could be sales, that could be customer acquisition, it could be a lot of things. You know, if you're doing something like related to machine learning, it could actually be like the accuracy of your machine learning algorithm, right? It could be a lot of different things. But from a day-to-day operation standpoint, you do want to create some what we call leading indicators, like kind of like the indicators that drive your North Star metric, right? So if your North Star is customer acquisition, right, number of customers that buy your product, the way that we do is that, you know, we just break it down into a very simple funnel, right? So, you know, you have leads, and then leads become qualified leads, and then you show demos to qualified leads. And then, you know, they do their request for quotations, and they do their bake-off between different vendors, and then eventually you win the account and you actually acquire that customer, right? So these leading indicators lead to your North Star metric, which is customer acquisition. And it's important to measure every step of the funnel, so you kind of know like which step of the funnel things break down that you can further optimize. All right, learn. So now we're at the final step of the build, measure, learn cycle. So to us, learning means that we make a pivot or persevere decision. So we formed a hypothesis, we built something, we talked to the customer, we learned from them, and now we have to decide, okay, did we validate or invalidate our hypothesis, and are we ready to move on to the next experiment, right? So that's why we make what's called a pivot versus persevere decision. And our 6-week cycles are actually called PVP cycles, pivot versus persevere cycles, because it's all about that end step where we're saying, okay, we'll continue, you know, forging ahead, or we pivot and we try to do something else. So the way that we define pivot is that a pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. This actually is a little bit controversial. Like a lot of people don't think of pivot like this, but you know, at least this is how we think about it. Let me give you a specific example of this. How many people recognize this picture? Do you guys know what this app is? Bourbon. Nope. Okay. All right. You are all too young to remember. So this was Instagram before Instagram. So this was Kevin and Mike's app that they got funded for, which is called Bourbon. And Bourbon is basically Foursquare, right? It's one of these location-based checking apps that were kind of popular in the early 2000s. So they did Bourbon. Actually, I think it did okay. It did average. I think there was like a little bit of usage and engagement. It was like just like an average app, right? I think Foursquare did location-based check-in better. So they were kind of like, well, this is like kind of not working, but kind of working. You know, what do we do next, right? So they decided, couple of things, right? So first they thought about, okay, so what do we want people to do? Like their vision is to help users share their daily lives with their close ones, right? So Bourbon does it, and you can argue that Instagram also does it, right? So you can argue that actually by pivoting from this to Instagram, they actually had a change in strategy, like a different app, but without change in vision. So their vision actually stayed the same throughout the whole pivot. And number two, they kind of like took apart this app, and they're like, okay, what about Bourbon, this location-based checking thing worked? And what worked was that the pictures that people were sharing, like that was like what people liked the most. Like people just love scrolling through, and they would like skip all the posts that didn't have pictures, and they would like spend more time looking at the posts that had pictures. And what they realized was that, well, location-based check-in is actually a feature, not a product. The product is actually the photo sharing. And that turned out to be true even for Foursquare. Like, I don't know if you guys know the story of Foursquare, but basically it basically turned out that, location-based, check-in apps are basically all no longer exist, right? Like Foursquare nowadays, I think it's a little bit more like Yelp, right? And then you have location-based check-in as a feature in products like Google Maps, right? But they really their users really like the photo sharing feature. So they pivoted to just focus on this. So completely different brand, different app, different use case, but their vision didn't change because they're still trying to help their users share their daily lives with their close ones. So this was one of the kind of most popular examples of a successful pivot in the history of startups. So so a couple of things about pivot. Number one, you learned a bunch of things from the experiment that you ran, and you want to do something with it. So you had to decide, okay, if that validates our hypothesis and we still believe strongly in, both this vision and strategy, then we should persevere. We should keep going, right? We should run the next related experiment. And if it doesn't, then you should try something else. And that doesn't mean that you change your whole company. It just means that you pivot and you run a different experiment. You want to memorialize it and make a conscious decision. So it's not about you coming in tomorrow, you're like, oh, I don't feel like running our previous experiment anymore. I just feel like doing something else today. It's not about that. It's about having some structure and memorializing the decision, so then your whole team can rally around it. And also it's about doing it fast. So at LTSE, we do it every 6 weeks. Bourbon did it, I think, after 2 years. Sometimes you hear about these major pivots that either work or didn't work, and it's almost always couple years into the startup's life. But we actually try to pivot every 6 weeks because, that terrible example I gave for one of the previous products I built at my previous company, why spend 6 months out of our 18-month runway to build something that turned out that nobody wanted, and all we had to do was just call our customers and be like, well, given this screenshot, will you use this product? And they would have said no, right? We could have learned that quickly and pivoted quickly, but we didn't. And that cost the company a lot of runway. So we try to do it as fast as possible. Okay, another kind of related topic is, okay, after you ran a bunch of experiments and you decide, well, do we pivot or persevere? One of the things that people use as a gauge is okay, do I have product market fit? Whenever people first think about this question, and maybe they have a vague answer to, oh, I kind of do have product market fit, I have 10 customers really loving my product, but it's almost always the case that you actually don't. It's actually a very common mistake that people think that they have product market fit when they don't. And the way that we define product market fit is that moment when a product finally finds a widespread set of customers that resonate with it. So this kind of goes beyond the doing things that don't scale, because you want to make your first 10 customers happy, and then you want to prove the value for those 10 customers, but you also have to grow that. You have to scale that. You have to make sure that instead of 10, now you want 100 customers to buy into the same value, and then you want 1,000 customers to buy into the same value. So you want to continue to grow and expand. So that moment that when your product finally finds a widespread set of customers that resonate with it, that's when you have product market fit. And it takes many cycles to build, measure, learn cycles. So if you think about your North Star metric, right? Every startup has, well, every successful startup has a hockey stick graph, right? But keep in mind, there's no hockey stick without that bottom flat part. So you have to endure a lot of things that don't work on a lot of different cycles in order to get through that flat part, so you can have the stick part that actually goes up, right? So here's another quote from Patrick that I like. So he says that, at some point there was a very noticeable change in how Stripe felt. It tipped from being this boulder that we had to push from being a train car that in fact had its own momentum. So you kind of know that, you have a larger set of customers that really resonate. They're telling their friends and they're all coming on board. And then you pour more fuel into the fire. In that case, it will be more venture capital money, and then you scale your business. All right, that's all I have. I do have some general LTSE product development principles that we can talk about. if you guys are interested, but I don't want to go too deep into LTSE. I know we're kind of already over time. And then here's how you can find me in general.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Ray. Really appreciate your time and being generous and going over. But I found that really valuable. I'm sure our founders did. Does anybody have any more questions? I know we had some people asking questions as we went along. But if there are any other questions, then feel free to ask now.
Hey Ray, yeah, that was really great. So we are currently pilot testing our initial hardware, right? So when you say go, review, learn, in this process, one thing confusing is we are not at the level where we propose it. It's not a complete set of features that we promised, right? So some customer review depends or is affected because what we're putting in front of them is not exactly what we promised. How do you navigate that?
Apologize. I missed the last bit that you said. My internet connection is still not super stable.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Would you mind repeating the last bit, please?
So when we right now go to customer, right, and put our glasses on, they are not giving the full functionality that we promised or when we discussed the first time. That's not what they're getting.
Gotcha.
And their reviews kind of affected by that. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, of course. So I can give you a couple examples. Let's go back to our CRM, customer relationship management product example. I know it's very different than what you're trying to build, but this might be helpful. So CRM product and so on is actually a very large scope, right? It's a very complex enterprise SaaS software. So like if I was to kind of try to reinvent the category, I wouldn't say, okay, I'm going to build a CRM from scratch and try to basically meet feature parity with Salesforce, right? Because there would never be the end of that, right? So what I would do is I'll try to, well, number one, find customers that you can reach easily. And it sounds like, you're running a pilot. So that's great. Sounds like you're already serving some early adopters. So props for that, great job. I will go to them. I'll try to find kind of a small subset of features that they really care about. And what I would do is just like really simplify your MVP. So for CRM specifically, maybe what they like is that, Salesforce is actually a decent central store of data, right? Like all my customer data going there. So that might be okay. But maybe what they don't like is the analytics, right? Like maybe they're like, oh, I want this graph. I want that graph. I want this report. I want, I don't know, a graph on my phone or something, right? So then I will actually use the Salesforce platform and try to build on top of it and try to build, some analytics features. So really, I think this depends on how you define your MVP and like, what is that minimum set of product, right? So if you think about MVP, right? MVP stands for minimum viable product. So it has to be both minimal and viable. Now, if your customers are telling you, well, sorry, the MVP you're delivering to me isn't viable for me, then it's not actually MVP. So it's about like thinking about what was actually, that viable part. And unfortunately, if you have too many early adopters telling you that, sorry, this doesn't work for me because you're missing X, then you might just have to go build X, or you might have to find another like more niche use case out of your whole scope to target. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And in our case, what's happening is maybe we are promising overboard above what MVP is and expecting that to be the MVP. Because we have one base set of features that they're good with, they like that. But we are promising something on top of that we don't have nailed down yet.
Yeah, I would just say like really focus on the hypothesis that you're trying to test. It is quite dangerous when you go to your customers and they're just like, oh, I want X, and then you deliver X, they're like, I want Y. But you just have to keep in mind, like, did you validate your initial hypothesis, or maybe like they don't like any of the things that you ship? Then basically you have to go back to square one and say, okay, my MVP is actually, it's minimal, but it's just not viable, and that doesn't actually work.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks.
Anyone else? right. If not, we'll wrap up here. But yeah, thank you so much, Ray. Really appreciate your time. This was awesome. Really enjoyed the presentation. I like all the examples that you gave. Definitely want to have you back